Hello, everyone. We are live here on all of the different IOCDF social media platforms. So you can either be joining us from iocdf.org/live. That's kind of like our home base. You might be seeing us on Twitch, LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, other social media platforms, Periscope. So we really enjoy everybody coming out today. What I always like to tell people is to start, just kind of introduce yourself in the chat. Go ahead and say hi, tell us where you're from. I'm always interested to find out who you're here supporting. So you're here supporting yourself? Are you here supporting others? We'd love to hear that. So whatever social media platform you're on, if you could jump on and just kind of say hi, introduce yourself, let us know where you're from, who you're supporting, anything that you're kind of feeling today. So we have a really excited special Lunch and Learn. So what is the Lunch and Learn? Most of the time you're going to see Liz McIngvale and myself doing an Ask the Expert. So we're going to be answering your questions. We're going to be talking about all the different topics and themes that you have questions about. But once a month, every third Wednesday of the month, actually the fourth Wednesday of the month rather, we do a special Lunch and Learn. And that's where we take a topic that came out of the conference or comes out of enough suggestions or comes out of previous discussion and really expand on that a little bit more. So the theme of today's episode is going to be talking about how language is used in the world of OCD. So how can a clinician talk to their clients with OCD in a way that's empowering and uplifting and separates themselves from the disorder? How can we talk about OCD in the general public that's not stigmatizing? And how can we talk about clients or clients that are struggling through therapy in different ways that feels empowering? So I have an all-star guest lineup today, so I'm super excited to jump into that topic. So once again, let us know where you're from, who you're here suggesting. As always, in a Lunch and Learn, we're going to talk about the main topic for the first 30 minutes or so and answer any questions. But if you have a general OCD question, definitely pop those in the chat as well. We also have a ton of pre-submitted questions that we can also get to. So if the theme itself is not why you're here today and it's a different theme, throw those questions in and we'll get to them. So before I introduce my guests, a couple just general housekeeping as always. So first and foremost, this live stream is educational and not intended to replace therapy. So what does that mean? That means for treatment related questions, please work with your provider or contact a local clinician. You can always use the IOCDF's online resource directory at iocdf.org/find-help to locate a trained clinician near you. Also, the IOCDF is not a crisis hotline, so if you're in a crisis or you're feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room or call 911 or the suicide prevention hotline at 800-273-8255. Also, we want to create a safe space and be kind and respectful to everyone. At the end of the day, we're all here to support each other. A note, this is being broadcast on several social media platforms and is being recorded for later view. A couple quick announcements. On Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, National Advocate Ethan Smith is going to do a community conversations live stream. You can also submit questions ahead of time for him or for the Ask the Experts with Liz and myself on our social media at IOCDF or just at IOCDF, like on Instagram or Twitter. Just send a question on Facebook or online at iocdf.org/peace of mind. And then last announcement, if you are a Spanish speaker, our 2022 Spanish Language OCD Conference is just a few weeks away, and volunteer applications for bilingual Spanish-English speakers are still open. So all volunteers will receive a free registration to this conference as well as the online OCD conference in November. Learn more and apply to volunteer. There's going to be a link on conference. Okay, that's in Spanish. So it's CONFERENCIDETOC.com. Liz says it much better than me. I'm in California, so I have no excuse, but she's in Texas, so that's why she says it so well. It's on the screen right there. All right, so cool. So those are all of our announcements. Liz McIngvale isn't going to be joining us today. I'm really bummed about that. She actually has something that she has to tend to, but she will be back next week for the Ask the Expert. So it's just going to be myself today, and hopefully that's not terrible. Everybody's okay with that.
Because of me, she couldn't deal with me. That was why.
I know. She was like, "Jason's coming. Nope. Can't do it. Gotta run."
Sorry, everybody.
She's out. She's like, them? Well, cool. Okay, so let me introduce our guest before we jump into the topic. So who you just heard speaking is Dr. Jason Krompinger. Dr. Jason Krompinger is a clinical psychologist with expertise in treating OCD and related disorders. He is currently the director of clinical training at the New England Center for OCD and Anxiety. He's a faculty member at the Behavioral Therapy Training Institute, BTTI, which, by the way, OCD SoCal is doing one in October, and a lecturer part-time at Harvard Medical School. He previously was the Director of Psychological Services at the McLean Hospital OCD Institute. In his professional role, he provides supervision and consultation to students, postdoctoral fellows, early career psychologists, and seasoned clinicians seeking to specialize in OCD. He has co-authored several articles and delivered talks, seminars, and community trainings on understanding and working with OCD. So hello. Do you like Dr. Krompinger, Jason,
please.
Dr.
No.
Jason?
Jason, please.
All right, Jason,
Thanks so much
it's
for
good to
having
see
me.
you. Thank you
Good
so
to
much
see you.
for being here.
You're welcome.
All right, and then our next guest is Katy Rothfelder. And Katy specializes in supporting individuals suffering with OCD and related disorders, as well as neurodiverse populations. She believes that people of all identities and abilities in all bodies deserve equal access to quality mental health care. Katy is an advocate and cheerleader for compassionately tailored evidence-based practice, including ACT and ERP. She is a published author on mental health narrative and one of the nation's top rhetorical journals, speaks often at local and national conferences, and serves as the chair for the Communications Committee and CE Committee for the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. Well, welcome, Katy.
Thanks, Chris. I gave you a mouthful of an introduction to my...
I'm like, for sure. Exhausted, right? No, I'm just kidding. Well, thank you so much for being here. Before I jump in with you, just a reminder for everybody watching this, we are talking today about how language impacts treatment, and also we're going to answer general questions at the 35-minute after mark. So please get those general questions in, as well as say hi and who you're here to support. So I'm going to kind of throw it to you, Katy. I mean, it was funny because Liz and I came up with this topic because of some kind of conversation, and then shortly after that I know that you had written something that you were passionate about, and we're like, hey, that's perfect, Katy, jump on it. So maybe kind of tell the audience just a little bit about like what you're kind of passionate about when it comes to like language and the way that we talk about OCD and individuals with a disorder.
Yeah. Wow, Chris, you put me on the spot there. Well, I'll give the narrative first, I suppose, of so the IOCDF conference is back in the end of July. And that was the first time that I attended as a clinician who was seeing clients with OCD and anxiety versus being just a trainee. And the first time that I had really also kind of given advanced talks as well as educational talks. And, it's this really inclusive space. And yet I noticed from time to time, not, across the board, that there was some language that was being used that just felt kind of like that hurts my heart. If other humans who are struggling with OCD were to hear that, like, how would that impact them? And just being curious or wondering about that. I think we also had really impactful and important talks. I can't remember the name of the talk. But Alec Pollard and Renee and I think Patrick ended up not being able to join, but did give a really what I thought was compassionate and affirming kind of talk about clients who are in treatment for a long period of time. But I think that when I sent that email to Jeff and to you all, I think for me, it was more of a call to action to saying this is something that I've been hearing again and again. And each time it seems to be like a little bit of a gut punch of, wow, I hope that my clients and the people that I know struggle with OCD don't hear that. And I think we're all human and we're all doing the best that we can and are shaped by the language that has been given us in our learning histories, and that doesn't mean that we don't have opportunities to acknowledge those things and then grow and change. I think also being like really heavily involved in the ACT community and knowing that an underpinning of ACT is the language, and language is behavior. And so feeling really passionate about OCD to really be able to understand how language functions or how it is working in a room to support a client or lead them back towards that, like away away moves that are digging them deeper into their OCD, and we play a part in that. And so I think that's kind of why I was like leaning into like, hey, let's keep talking about this. It was a long-winded answer to your question, Chris.
No, it's perfect. And that kind of gives me something to jump into in a second. Jason, same question. Like, what about language and why is it important? And what, kind of what is your thoughts about the topic today?
Yeah, I mean, Katy said a bunch of really great stuff, and I agree with all of it. So just to sort of add on to that, I think that something I think about too, there's the actual language, literally the words that we use, which are important. And then there's like the way that we communicate, like just the spirit behind it, the undercurrent, that I think that we as a community need to pay more attention to. I think that, it's there's a bunch of specifics to get into, but, in treating OCD, it's easy to get very, I think, excited as a clinician, just sort of like, hey, here we have these like really powerful treatment, and we should get excited. We have these really powerful treatments that work, or that, are thought to work, or that, we have a lot of evidence behind them, et cetera. But then there's a way that can sort of translate into sort of a mismatch between our tone and our sort of like whole milieu and whatever the person that you're sitting with is kind of experiencing and bringing to the table. And, it can sort of be inadvertently invalidating, I think, if we're sort of like, hey, we're all fired up and excited about your exposure. Meanwhile, the person's just sort of like, yeah, I'm sitting here terrified to do this. It's not sort of bringing the appropriate level of, I guess, like solemnity and gravitas, if that makes sense, to the context. So I think a lot about that stuff, and just generally speaking, this idea that not everybody's different, it's literally I came from McLean. I was working at McLean Hospital for 12 years, and we used the word patient a lot. And now I'm more into the outpatient setting where client is more used a lot. And what I found is that it's not I'm happy to talk about this more, but just, it's not necessarily that one word is better or worse than the other. It's more just what makes the person that you're with kind of more kind of at ease and kind of feel more safe and more sort of like in a place to connect. For some people, for example, patient actually is very much not stigmatizing, because, why can I not be a patient in this setting, but I can be a patient at the dentist or something like that. So kind of thinking about all those little nuances to our thinking that we have to take with each different person that we're interacting with.
Yeah, and I think what I heard from you, Jason, is just this idea that we have to be flexible. Like, we're, kind of meet the client where they're at. So if the client is like, likes a certain term or certain word, kind of meeting at that. When I think of the topic and when I get really excited about it, is like what I've always tried to do. So having OCD myself, I think what's the most difficult part of it is it sort of like from childhood starts to kind of crawl into us, almost like merge with our identity. And, I always kind of think of like those alien movies where it's like the alien comes in and starts making you host. And that's how I really felt. And so, a lot of times I hear people with OCD saying like, well, if I drop the OCD, I'm going to do bad in school. Or if I drop OCD, I won't be as careful. And so one of the things that I have always worked on in my own care is like separating myself from the disorder. And what I found personally is language is so huge to that. So, talking about like the OCD or acting like OCD is in the room, and having the client almost like me talking to the client as a person, and then saying, okay, how is the OCD showing up today? And by separating it, what I found is like even naming it. It was something I was only doing with kids originally, of like having kids name the OCD, but getting even adults to start to name it and talk about it as an other, and seeing families talk about it as other. And the more and more that happens, kind of people get separated from the disorder. And I think that that's one thing that I see sometimes is like people identify so much with it. And if you don't change the language and way that you speak with it to the client, they're gonna not want to drop certain compulsions, because they're actually going to see them as behavioral traits that they find value in. And if you're not addressing that in that manner, they're going to think, well, wow, Chris is trying to change me. That's not why I came to therapy. So that's kind of like my sort of heart and soul in this topic, and why I think it's important. Katy, go on.
Go ahead, Chris.
No, you go.
Well, I was thinking too, what I hear you saying is, there is a part of OCD for a person with this neurobiological condition, but it's a single part. So when you are in a room with a client, you're seeing a whole human being. And even when I walk into a room with a client, usually it's like my first response is like, "Hey, human, how's it going?" And I think, sometimes what happens when we as clinicians are engaging in ERP or CBT or ACT is it's really easy, and what our brains are designed to do to want to make it simple so that our brains aren't working really hard. And it becomes a set of rules for clinicians. And wow, isn't that so human that then our clients with OCD also have rules that are trying to help simplify their experience and keep them functioning until it no longer works for them. And so if we want our clients to start to notice their thoughts, notice their experience with OCD, and be flexible around that, like, we ourselves have to stop attending to a bunch of rules about, like, no, you need to start doing ERP right now. Like, that's the rule. And tending to the person that's in the room, not tending to the OCD, but the person, and how their thoughts are functioning, how the language that we're using is functioning. And so if someone's saying my OCD is functioning to support them and noticing something, then okay, let's do it. If someone's saying like, well, the OCD made me do it, isn't actually helping them to externalize and create some distance, well then, like, hey, let's shift that. But a part of our, a job as a clinician is to take responsibility and notice, like, how language is functioning in the room to either support a client in moving towards what matters, or even sinking them farther into that hole. And that's on us as much as it's on the person. So that's just what was kind of coming up for me as we were kind of talking about it.
Totally. And noticing, just to throw one, totally. Noticing as a clinician, when you go to say something, what are you doing exactly? It's kind of the function thing. So am I saying this in the service of what's going to be most helpful to the person? Or am I saying this, am I jumping on something because I'm responding to something inside of me that says, oh, if I don't say this right now, I'm not a good clinician, or I'm not a good OCD therapist, or something like that. Like, a really good OCD therapist is someone that has to be very much on top of every single potential problematic behavior and sort of like pointing them out and developing awareness around it and stamping them all out. But maybe that's not what the person needs to hear in that particular moment, in the service of actually moving forward in treatment. So noticing the functions in that way, I think are important.
Well, and I think something that I learned the hard way is, like, when we talk about the word function, we know what that means, but sometimes other people don't know what that means. And so, like, the simplest definition that I come up with is like, how is that working? Yep. Function helps us to identify, like, what is working for you. And so just to kind of clarify, if there are like public people watching us right now, that's what we mean when we're talking about it.
Well, that's what I like about, when you really start to kind of turn treatment, that's what I liked about the addition of ACT, is just the way that you talk to a client. I think that lens feels much more human for me. It's not like we're going in and we're trying to attack the disorder. It's more so the way that I visualize it, and the way that I speak in session with clients is like what you're saying, Katy, is like, you're a human being. And if I would have met you before the OCD really hit, just like if people would have met me before the OCD really hit, you were somebody like who liked sports, or you're somebody that traveled, or you're somebody that loved dating, or you loved cuisine. And now, because of the disorder, suddenly you're at this point where you can't leave the house and you're struggling and you're suffering. Like, what can we do together as a team to start to kind of like combat the OCD? What changes can we make? How can we view your intrusive thoughts and these doubts and this uncertainty different? And so what I've found is that when you speak to a client like that, like, you're kind of activating that human side of them to say, like, you're right, I do want that. I always say, I know my why for why I went to treatment, and I always am trying to pull the why out of a client so that they see their value in treatment. And I think sometimes if the therapy is just being done to someone, it's almost like a natural resistance. So when you kind of start to speak to the client, like to the whole client, and I think sometimes people get afraid of that because they're like, well, my client came from a talk therapist for 8 years, talked about their feelings and their like sports, and what do you miss? And I'm like, yeah, but you can do it in a way in treatment that you're doing something about it. Like, you're definitely addressing it, but you're having the person not think that they're doing the treatment just to get better. It doesn't, I work with a lot of teens and young adults. It does not work to tell the client, like, we're going to do treatment so that your mom is happier. Like, you know, it's like, how do you value? Oh, you love baseball and OCD is making it hard to play baseball. Awesome. What are some things that we can do to get baseball easy again? So talking to them as like the human who happens to have a disorder that's attacking their life versus like making the disorder the front center of every conversation, I find like is very helpful.
Yeah.
And we can't toss aside the, you know, the quote unquote non-specific factors that are kind of the active ingredients in even talk therapy, where, right, it's not the indicated treatment for OCD, but, you know, the idea of making a connection with somebody, you know, creating a relationship and having that be sort of the home base through like via which you can launch into ERP and all the other really, really challenging stuff that the person's going to be doing in treatment. I think is we need to honor that.
Mm-hmm. And I think acknowledging the, like, you know, we as clinicians can do harm when we are kind of giving into those rigid rules of like, if a client, you know, their reason, if their why is, I want to come in so that I start feeling better, and we're like, okay, let's get you feeling better by doing this ERP, then we're missing something. And so being able to tend to of like, and from this frame of act, which, you know, that is part of who I am. It's like, you know, for us to be whole people, we have to be flexible in noticing how our behaviors are working for us, and notice, like, with this one life that we have, like, as long as you are living and breathing, are you doing what's most important to you? And what we find often with OCD is like, OCD is taking choice away from you. And autonomy is something so central of like wanting to understand ourselves and have an orientation to our lives. And when OCD takes that choice away from you, you know, being able to help a client in identifying ways to like, let's get you back. Like, let's have you be stronger than this OCD. And then even noticing that word stronger can also have a different function. So trying it out and then seeing what happens. And, you know, we're all humans. We're all going to try things, and maybe they work and maybe they don't, and seeing what's helpful to a person.
The other thing I think is important with language is I noticed that everybody with OCD tends to be very hard on themselves. People with depression tend to be very hard on themselves, anxiety. And so to me, I even work on having like the language change in the session, because the client typically is coming in and it's just like beating themselves alive. And it's like, oh my God, no, like we have to get you back to a point. I always tell clients, like, it's okay to be like the number one leader of your own fan club. Like, it is okay to want you to do well and want to support. So what are some things that you do to help clients change language within themselves? What are some things that you found over the years have been helpful to get a client to really start to, I know it kind of sounds cheesy, but one of my goals is always to get a client to like themselves again. I know for me, when I was at my worst, I just hated that I was like isolated, no friends, not dating. And so then I misinterpret that as like something's flawed with me. And I was very low on myself. And I see that so much. So kind of for both of you, like, what is a way that you help clients change language?
So just a thought that I have about, is a really good question. One thought that I have about that is acknowledging that changing that into that self-talk and addressing it is almost like an exposure, or is kind of like an exposure for plenty of folks, wherein beating up on yourself, not self-flagellating, can feel risky, can feel like irresponsible, can feel indulgent in some way. And if, especially when folks have an idea that, well, I should feel, if I'm treating myself more gently and kindly and, you know, being more my own fan, as you say, Chris, that should feel good. That should be positive. No, it's actually going to be quite hard. And that might be a weird thing to say. It's like, how have I helped? I think that's been really useful for a lot of folks, to just acknowledge that, yes, like, this will be, my brain will have all kinds of comments, things to say about the fact that I am trying this out. You know, I'm trying on this, you know what, I'm not going to do that to myself thing. And I'm going to treat myself like a human. I'm going to treat myself like I'm allowed to take up space in this world. You know, that is different, and it's going to again, my brain's going to have a whole narrative around that. If it were easy, I would already be doing it. So kind of like acknowledging that all those kinds of inner experiences will arise in making that change, I think is important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
one thing that real quick, Katy, and then I'll get back to you because I'll forget it. One thing that you said, Jason, that's really important is I was looking at a document that Patrick McGrath and John Hirschfeld and one other clinician had put together of like different compulsions that people don't recognize as compulsions, and that was one of them, like self-punishment. And I see that a lot in clients with intrusive, taboo thoughts. It's like, because I'm having this thought, how dare I go out and treat myself with Chipotle?
Exactly.
Like, why am I sitting on a beach when I just had thoughts about killing my kids? Like, how dare I think I deserve that? And so once again, it's like that. I think that's where the language comes important, because if not, people are going to be punishing themselves. And whenever I bring that up to a client, they've never recognized that as a compulsion. Yeah. I did a presentation to all our support groups this week on that sheet that they put out. And half of the clients were like, I do that all the time. I didn't realize that was OCD. And so sometimes like even just changing the way that you treat yourself, like you said, is actually an exposure.
Yeah. I think that people, sorry, just real quick. I think that folks, they kind of hear the standard definition of ritual or compulsion, where it all makes you feel better in the short term. It's like, well, those things don't make me feel better, but indeed they're functioning in this particular way where it's like, yes, they create this really bad experience, this negative experience of self-flagellation, but it's almost like that's preferable to, like you say, having the intrusive thought and not doing that. That feels very much like I'm letting myself off the hook, which is worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, my ultimate goal is not to tell, but to support a client and noticing like how it's that language is working for them. And I don't think it's isolated to OCD. Like, our brains are hardwired to solve problems. The really just part of OCD is that, like, as long as you're trying to solve a problem, it's never going to get fixed. And if you've ever been like trying to put IKEA furniture together and you just can't figure it out, even though you've got the spreadsheet, like, chances are you're going to start to get frustrated and angry. And so our brains come up with that solution to solve the problem of like, well, if I can't do this, then I'm going to get angry and frustrated. And helping a client to say, so when you're talking to yourself, like, what do you notice happening? Like, is that supporting you moving forward? And then that starts a dialogue, but it also helps them to increase awareness around, what are you losing by engaging in that kind of self-sabotage and self-thinking? And it definitely can be a compulsion, and it can also just be a very human thing to do. I don't think it's isolated to OCD necessarily.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. And always kind of seeing like, what's behind it. It may be very human, may be very compulsive, maybe a combination of both. I think that having the disorder, it just takes us out of who we are. When we give into the disorder 100%, like I did at one point, and like many people watching, it's like you do get to a point where you kind of lose yourself. And I always tell people like that's part of the journey, is to get yourself back. Katy, I wanted to start with you and then get Jason's opinion. I know one of the things that you were really passionate about for this topic, and I want to make sure that we spend time on it, is, a lot of times we see people not willing to do the treatment. They just, I think a lot of times what happens is we get so fearful. I know for me, some of the things I didn't even realize was OCD. I just thought it was keeping me alive or safe. And so I think there's a lot of fear sometimes. There's a lot of connection with the disorder. There's a lot of safety. I think for me, there was some like hesitation once I was getting better to continue to get better, because I was like, oh my God, I've been like housebound and not functioning for 6 years. And if I get better, now I have to go get a job and move out on my own. And I want those things, but oh my God, I feel like I'm still mentally 16 and now on paper I'm 24. How am I going to go do those things with a 16-year-old mind? So I know sometimes like, somebody is struggling with treatment and it can seem like they don't want to get better and stuff. And I know that you were really like frustrated with some of the terms. So maybe kind of talk a little bit about what were some of the things that you've heard that you don't think are helpful, and ways that you can talk about somebody struggling with the treatment or not willing to do it, or parents that accommodate in a way that might be more helpful versus harmful.
Yeah. I mean, I think willingness is a term that we have kind of switched to, I think, maybe moving out of the SUDS era and into like the willingness area, but this can also kind of turn a little murky when we're like, oh, well, that client's just not willing to do that. And, you know, I'll definitely lean on, you know, I hope I can call her a mentor, but someone I am hugely grateful to, that we did a presentation at the IOCDF on functional analysis and process-based functional analysis, which is a big fancy term for let's identify how this behavior is working for you in the room. And one of the things she says is like, when a client comes into your room and says, I haven't done my homework, it's exciting to her because it gives her something to work with. You know, it allows her to say like, okay, so what is happening and what's getting in the way? And then when someone said, you know, like Chris, when you were talking about that, like that really understandable fear of there's no orientation, there's no roadmap of, now that I have been suffering so long, how do I move forward? Because it certainly doesn't fit society's narrative. And then coming back to that person of like, you know, one of the things that I love about ERP is that we learn to have confidence in who we are and ourselves, of like, yeah, this is really hard, and I totally believe that I can get through it, is one of the things that we start to learn. And those skills generalize. We start to see that, you know, I had a really tough day at work and I know I'm going to be okay. And you have to be careful because maybe then that turns into reassurance or something like that. But I think when we start using language like that client's not willing to engage in treatment, or they're treatment refusers, or those kinds of things, like, we as clinicians also need to take responsibility for the things that we're not attending to, because we're putting rules on our clients without actually noticing like what is happening for them. We don't have to have a prescription for ERP. It doesn't have to happen by this step model. Maybe it's going to look different for every person because every person is different. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know that was one of the things that you had commented on, like calling people treatment refusers and kind of clinicians like firing a client and just kind of giving up on them, you know, is just something that you kind of heard clinicians say in the past. And it was just something you didn't find very helpful. And that was sort of your passion around language. Like, how can we talk about it different? It always reminds me, is I was working with a client and their OCD therapist before them wasn't specialized, but knew some OCD, and was like, this client is not going to get better. And that was like my first thing. And they're not somebody that is like in our community. They were a practice that treated like 804 things. But I remember, and he was somebody that came in and was like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here, et cetera. And what I always do is I'm like, what's one thing you like that OCD makes really tough? And for him, it was video games. And I'm like, well, what if, because we were doing a one-on-one 3-week intensive together, and I'm like, what if we just sat there and played video games for 2 weeks together and just like checked in after 2 weeks and saw how that went? And, you know, and when things would become difficult, that would pop up, the education that I gave him and that he already had, he was willing to do it because it was in a space he liked. So I think sometimes we're so quick to like, if this method isn't working, kind of move on from that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, so a couple of thoughts just I had. So yeah, treatment refusers, not terribly a helpful term. I never got the idea of firing. Like, how could we fire? Like, they would fire us. People getting fired are the people like getting paid. That's us. I don't get the idea of like firing a client. Yeah, I think that's, I don't know that I've ever met somebody that I worked with who didn't want a better life. You know what I mean? Like this idea of saying that somebody doesn't want to get better. I think that the issue is that we really need to do our work in understanding the person and where they're coming from. So if somebody is a quote unquote treatment refuser, they have a pretty good reason for that. And we just have to find it, and we have to communicate that we understand it, not just literally saying those words, like that we get it, we understand. Even if you have a lived experience of OCD yourself, of course, it's so heterogeneous, right? You don't have their lived experience, but that we can articulate to them where they're coming from. I could say, okay, this is why, this is what I'm hearing from you. This is why, you can't bring yourself to do that, or why you're saying it's like, I don't want to make these changes right now, et cetera. And if you don't have that base to go from, I don't think you're really getting anywhere. So I think the person that you're working with needs to, I always say, like, they need to get that you get it. They need to understand that you understand and really believe that. And if you have that, I think then a lot of really great change can happen. And then you can kind of start to operate under this premise, or not start to, I think that generally speaking, we should operate under this premise that everybody can recover. I never have the thought of anybody that I work with that they can't. Some people, of course, have much more severe forms of the illness than others, but I don't think it's useful to look at it in any other way, actually.
Is there anything, Jason, that, like, when you're working with a client, because obviously, like, it sounds like both of you agree that using terms like that isn't helpful. Is there something, if you have a client that comes into your comes to see you for treatment and is really struggling with doing the work or pushing back against the OCD or finding value in it, is there anything that you do that you find that's really helpful? So if a clinician is watching this, or a parent or a wife or a child of somebody with OCD and is like, my loved one just doesn't seem to want to engage in therapy, if they can get them in the room, is there anything that you found that is helpful to kind of get them motivated to do the work?
Yeah, I mean, aside from the understanding bit, I think both of you have mentioned this a little bit. Certainly, connecting all the quote unquote work with whatever is deeply meaningful to them. First, not what's meaningful to you as a clinician, of course, not what's meaningful to their family necessarily, or not even what, it's just certainly not what society thinks is useful and meaningful to them. It's what they think is actually meaningful. So, certainly to do that work. But then also just this bit of, again, it sounds counterintuitive maybe, but this bit of compassion around it, around not wanting to do it, if that makes sense, where sometimes I think this gets back to the whole, we get really excited about this work kind of thing. I can kind of overshoot things, because we're behaviorists and because we come from this behavioral orientation of, okay, yes, do the work and you will get better. We can sort of inadvertently send this message like it's your fault if you're not getting better. If that makes sense, like that whole thing, which is pretty messed up. So certainly to sort of instill that idea of like, yeah, this is just because you have OCD and that you've got this kind of treatment in front of you doesn't mean you have to be perfect with it, and that you have to just every day wake up excited to jump in and do your exposures, just like anybody else. What across the human spectrum is not expected to do everything perfectly every single day. So again, maybe sounds counterintuitive, but kind of having that as a base to work off of, I think, is more productive than certainly, as Katy was mentioning a few times, this rigid kind of approach, this rigid rule set around what, like, the do's and don'ts of treatment.
And maybe, Katy, what you could touch on, because there's a lot of anxiety when somebody has OCD. Like, how do you talk to a client in a way that they can recognize that anxiety doesn't have to be a barrier from getting better? I think sometimes we misread with OCD, we misread anxiety as danger, and then we're not willing to make changes because it's like, well, I'm still alive and breathing. If I don't do that, if I do that, there's a chance. So how do you talk with clients in a way that feels them empowered to kind of push through some of that anxiety they're experiencing?
Yeah. I think first I really want to understand what are the contexts in which anxiety became dangerous for them. I think language, like going back to language, and maybe this will even relate to what Jason was saying, is like one of the biggest gifts that we could have as humans. It helps us make sense of the world and organize our life so that when I am looking at you, I'm like, oh, I have a computer, but I bet you, Chris, have a different computer than me, but we both call it a computer. But the same kind of language has also helped our brains to really automatically relate things in certain categories. And so sometimes, whether intentionally or unintentionally, there has been this idea that anxiety equals bad. Or if the gold standard treatment for OCD is ERP. And so if I am successful at ERP, then I am good. If I'm not successful at ERP, then I am bad. And so it's really trying to understand first, like, where did you get the idea that anxiety is bad? And shaping that, which I guess is a big fancy behavioral term of helping them to understand what we know about anxiety is that it's not necessarily dangerous. It's actually how we relate to our anxiety. If we see anxiety as a problem or a problem to be solved, then our brain will pay attention to it. It will magnify our symptoms because we've just told our brain, like, hey, there is something in your environment and it's actually inside you that is no longer like permitted to be here. And so if we start shifting our language around seeing anxiety, and it's not all at once, like you don't like some kind of treatment model, like, all right, anxiety is not dangerous, so you need to stop thinking about it that way. Like,
great, awesome. That felt great after one session.
But helping them to understand, like, well, and this is where I get really big into culture and society of like, we have been really conditioned to think these ways, and we've been conditioned to place things in good and bad categories, and OCD does that for us too. And if we can start to notice how that's actually working, and that's maybe our automatic belief that we have been trained and socially hardwired to do and act out, it's maybe not our second thought or our second belief about it. So when anxiety shows up for me, I may have the automatic reaction as a person to be like, shit, I gotta get rid of this anxiety. I've got a client in like 5 minutes and I can't be, and having that whole stream. And that might be my automatic reaction. But then supporting a client and noticing like, oh, that was my automatic reaction. And now it's my second reaction. And then shaping that or helping a client to understand to where maybe that doesn't become their automatic reaction after a certain amount of time. Just like when OCD shows up, it's, we may have an automatic reaction to OCD, and can we like over time get less and less hooked by it and notice like, oh, well, that thought doesn't really match me. This is the thought that matches me. So I'm going to go that way. So I think, I hope that answered your question, Chris.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just talking about anxiety in a very different way. Skylar, if you could put the comment up at 1206 from Felice Becker. So Felice says, now that I'm on the board, is there a reason spouses, partners are not part of any discussions? Check the virtual conference coming up and it's all about parents. We need more support from the IOCF. And I saw another comment lower, but before that, I will say, Skyla is our behind the scenes worker from the IOCF staff member. If you could put a comment about us doing a stream on that, I have more power with that, Felice, than I do with changing the structure of the conference. But I will definitely make sure in a meeting that we bring that up. But I definitely believe that's important. So maybe Jason, you could for a second kind of touch on that. Like, what is a way that spouses can be supporting them, like the person with OCD, but also supporting themselves? I think that that's one thing that I hear from a lot of spouses is they feel guilty if they're taking care of themselves while their loved one is suffering.
Yeah, I mean, well, just very concretely, I think this is where things like support groups are incredibly useful. So, finding, and there are more and more kind of sprouting up, I feel like every day, certainly the IOCDF, your local IOCDF chapter, hopefully if you have one, supports or sponsors a few of them. But there are others as well. And, finding a way to connect with others that have a similar experience, I think is really useful. I'll say it also, just kind of going off of what Katy was just talking about, this idea of kind of transforming anxiety a little bit, sort of seeing that what we're doing a lot with, I think, loved one support systems of folks with OCD is a lot of that, actually transforming certainly their own anxiety, but also the way they experience and relate to the anxiety of their loved one. Wherein, prior to treatment, they probably saw the anxiety of their loved one as a dangerous, like you're saying, Katy, a problem, something that needed to be addressed in some way. And starting to see that actually that the presence of that anxiety, especially when the person is engaging in treatment, or maybe in the context of a loved one resisting providing reassurance or providing some sort of accommodation, that anxiety is actually indicative of progression, of sort of like growth, and and can be seen as something that can lead towards change, even though it's painful and even though it's, of course, very, very challenging to navigate. So starting to kind of take that approach, wherein it's not just the person themselves need to see that the anxiety is not necessarily a dangerous thing, is a more human being experience, that loved ones can start to sort of see that as well. And again, just with support groups, I think from hearing from others, perhaps that are sort of further along, in treatment, et cetera, they can get a little bit of, I'll call it assurance, that, okay, things can change. Yes, it's really hard right now as we're starting to change all these accommodations, but things can change over time and get better.
Yeah, really well said. Desiree makes a comment at 12:24 that says, I like how you address a person as not just making someone happy, but getting back to things that make them happy and cope. What I wanted to add real quick, and then I have another question for you, Katy, is that I think of that as part of the treatment. Like, I don't think of like, if somebody is at a point where they're like, you know what, Chris, I can really handle any kind of like doubts and intrusions that come in my head. I'm really good at not giving into it. I don't think it's like, all right, it's been fun, bye. I mean, I think the next stages of treatment is like, let's get you back into things you like. What do you miss? Oh, you used to ride horses. How can we get you back into that? You've always wanted to get a master's. Let's figure out how to get you into that. So I believe that that's part of the treatment, because when somebody can get to that point, I can speak for my own self, you get further and further away from like the OCD version of yourself, and then you never want to go back. Patricia, so first of all, hi, but at 12:32, so I'll give this one to you, Katy. It says, I can relate to the negativity of treating yourself. My son is often negative about himself, and wanting to catch up on life experience makes him depressed, as it doesn't always go as fast as he wants. So how do you talk to a client who's like making progress, getting better, but it's not going at the speed that they would like?
Yeah, not going at the speed that they would like. I think validation is really important too. And even as Jason was talking, I was thinking about with family and partners, and I'm trained in something called SPACE, supportive parenting for anxious childhood emotions. And if you think about like a son that is noticing that he's making these strides, and yet still seeing that, like, here are where my peers are and I'm not there. Thinking about both validating like how painful that must be to notice from your eyes that there are people doing things that you want to be doing, and I also know that you're going to get there. And so this mix of like validation and confidence of, it's so hard to hear people being like, well, everyone's on their own timeline. And like, maybe when you're dating and single and be like, oh, well, everyone has their own, time. There's plenty of efficiency. That's a bunch of, that's a bunch of jealous. It's not nice. And so being able to validate, like, I see you, like, God, that must be hard. And I believe in you. I know that you are working hard. And I think, something that we as humans are really hardwired to do is look at things as like accomplishments or goals, rather than like the very intrinsic parts of us that are living out our action. So if we think of values as like, I'm going to do this thing because it maps on to my value, versus like, this is how I live my life, not knowing the outcome. So day by day, I'm going to do these things that matter to me. And in my experience of doing that, sometimes that actually gets us to where we need to be, while also being like compassionate towards like the idea that everyone has different values, everyone has different learning histories, and but sometimes a kid doesn't need to hear that first. Sometimes they need to be validated and saying like, you seeing them, like I know that must be hard, and I see you, and I see where you're going, and like bringing that attention back to them.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Jason.
I was going to say quickly, I agree. You know, and validation can be harder than some of us might think, in terms of like how to actually do it. I think we all, meaning clinicians, you know, can know the words to say, but man, you got to be careful. You know, if you, depending on how you say them, ironically enough, they can sort of come across as invalidating, and sort of like, especially like you're reading from a script, or like a, you know, oh, I learned this in school. Like, so what you're supposed to say at this point, validation has to be real and genuine. And sometimes you have to end a session, you know, but sometimes it might be useful to end a session just with the, yeah, that sucks. Even though there's some party that says, no, there's got to be the other, I got to add the little tag on that, like, and this kind of stuff too, which of course is useful for plenty of people, but maybe for the person sitting in front of you at that particular moment on that particular day, it's just more like, yeah, okay, I hear that, I hear this, and this sucks. It sucks that you missed this. It sucks. All you want to do is go to your freaking prom and you couldn't, or whatever it was. There's only one. There's only one of those. You're not gonna be able to do it again. Yeah, that sucks. Yeah, it can be scary. So go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I always think of the treatment as a second language. So I always try to remind everyone, like, learning ERP is like learning a new language. So it's not, we're not going to jump on top of it right away, to give it some time. Not really a question, but I just wanted to put Laura's comment up at 1237. Therapeutic alliance is cornerstone to desired outcomes. I think you said it, Jason, so she's saying well said. I think that's so important. One thing about this treatment is we're asking people to face some difficult things, and if you don't have a connection with that person in the room, it can be really hard. Jason, I'll give you this question at Sarah's at 1237. It's a longer question, and she was making some comments, but I'll sum it up into this, is like, sometimes people with OCD find it hard to have the motivation to really get better because they're at a point where they're high functioning. So they can have a job, a life, a relationship, you know, they haven't hit rock bottom, or they're not like in that point where they're not able to leave the home. They're able to keep it all together. What is a way that a loved one or a person with, or a clinician can kind of like draw the kind of, how do you address that if somebody's like, I'm doing well, and not feeling very motivated because of that?
Totally. I mean, again, totally makes sense. And there are plenty of folks in this exact boat where it's like they somehow, amidst the OCD, right, are holding down a job, holding down a relationship, all that sort of stuff. And so it makes total sense that it would be hugely challenging. The way I'd start to think about it is you'd want to create some awareness in the person, and help them to just kind of gently guide them to notice, okay, the things that you do, you know, to what extent are they actually translating into you being able to do your job? Or is it layering on this extra stuff that you have to wade through in order to get to whatever that thing is? I totally get that you're doing your job, and that it's ostensibly it's going well, and you're getting good reviews and all that sort of stuff. So it's easy to be very sort of simplistic and say, okay, I'm doing well. Here's all the things that I'm doing. So therefore I need to keep all of it in order to continue to do well. But in reality, it's more nuanced than that. So we're starting to take a look at, okay, so all the little things, like, so that extra, you know, just a simple example, I guess, the extra, you know, 3 rereads of that email that you send. So that translates into you doing well for you. Just notice how that works for you. Does it generally move you towards what's meaningful to you, or is it something that's more about you trying to control your experience and keep you stuck? And just kind of, it's not about sort of like, you know, browbeating the person or anything like that. It's just this kind of, you're just creating this context where you're sort of fostering more awareness and more noticing of all these different things that they're doing throughout the course of the day. And as we've been talking about the whole time, Katy, how they function. Yeah.
Well, I think too, like, I feel the need to validate Sarah too with that of, I think it's really easy to jump in with like, well, you're doing so well, like you're functioning so well, and you know, to provide those kind of reassurances, and as people who suffer, I certainly don't want to place this on you, Chris, and as, even just as humans, but this idea of like, we never know what's going on internally with someone or behind closed doors. And so just because someone is able to or has had a learned history and a way of sort of masking, we ask people, autistic folks and people with neurodiversity, to do that all the time in order to participate in society. Just because they do it doesn't mean that it's easy for them. And so just because we're able to kind of flip a switch and put our shoulders back and take deep breaths and then open the door and say like, hey, how's it going, doesn't necessarily mean that someone isn't struggling or deserving of help and support. And then when someone is really struggling in such a way that they're still functioning in their life, I think it's totally what Jason says. It's like looking at like, what are the smaller things that are keeping you stuck and leading to that stress and that just prolonged suffering.
Absolutely.
And again, in removing those things, it will feel risky because they feel like, as the person, I think the person said, they feel like I need or you said it too, Chris, I need these to survive. I need these to sort of, do what it is that I need to do. So it's exposure.
I want us to get, I know we only have a couple minutes, but I will speed round it for the last two questions because I think they're both good. So I'll give you the first one, Jason, and then you the second one, Katy. Allison at 1239, I'll sum it up for you, Jason. Basically, like, what do you do if you kind of have lower self-esteem and a therapist is using words to describe you that hurts, but you feel broken and scared to reach out for help or speak up? Like, what is a way if somebody's working with a therapist and maybe they do like some of it, or they do want to still work with them, or they don't have another option? How can somebody maybe approach a therapist? Like, how could Allison talk to them and say, hey, some of the things that you're saying in session is harmful?
Yeah, that sucks. First of all, that really sucks, seriously, to be in that situation. I get two thoughts. I read that before, and two thoughts. I mean, one thought, if the kind of more charitable interpretation, if the person was kind of well intended, but the impact was this. I think then, it makes sense to, it's totally okay to bring this kind of stuff up in treatment. We are well beyond the days of like the therapist is up here and the person is down here and like it's this hierarchy. That's, that's long gone. We're moving past that as best we can. So, I would expect anybody that I was working with to bring that up in any way that they find, that they're most comfortable in doing that. And frankly, if you're working with somebody who's not tolerant of that, then they're not. I don't think they're a good therapist. Frankly, I don't know if they're going to get up for this. If y'all just say one of the things, it's easy for me to just say that, to bring this, it's that you're not really in a position of power. If you can sort of bring in loved ones or other folks that can be supports to you to sort of help have that conversation. If it's more comfortable to sort of more have that, to kind of bring in somebody that you're close to and say, hey, this is what's going on with my therapist, and then bring them into the room, so to speak, to help have that kind of a conversation. I think that's completely appropriate too.
Yeah.
Well said. All right. Last question for you, Katy, is at 9:44 a.m. from Patricia. It says, what happens a lot of times with people with OCD is it hits them really hard during those like very influential kind of like life stages, and it can happen in their teens, and then they kind of feel like they've missed some of those like social cues and things and feel behind. What would be like some quick advice for someone that's experiencing that?
Yeah. I mean, I think acknowledging something that we don't acknowledge a whole lot is grief. And like disenfranchised grief of like the things I missed while I was really suffering. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as clinicians and educate ourselves on grief and different parts of grief. Mislearning some social skills and how to interact with people. So, I mean, one thing that I will say, like validating that is both hard, and having confidence in your son as someone who can learn those skills, and being able to move forward. And so, so if OCD has taken that from you, like what an incredible thing to be like, I find myself like wanting to, I'm just trying to be appropriate. Like watch me take my life back, watch me learn these skills, while also holding space for the grief that comes with that.
Absolutely. I'm going to answer Janine's real quick at 12:55. A fiance of somebody with OCD, and they're worried that the OCD and all the struggle with that may cause them to split up. What I would say, Janine, is I always want loved ones to think of the person with OCD and the disorder as two separate kind of entities. And so what can you do to show up and support your fiance in a way that you've always supported him? So outside of OCD, if he's had a hard time at work, or if family member has passed, or if him and a friend get in an argument, how did you show up and support him without fixing it for him? That's how we want to see it there, is like be loving to the person. And then the OCD, we want to be firm. So if it's answering questions, if it's listening to confessions, if it's giving OCD an audience, if it's doing things for the OCD, that's not who you're getting married to soon, right? So we're going to be able to say to him, like, I really, really understand where you're coming from with those questions. I think those are better for your therapist to answer, but I want to be here for you. What can I do with you today? Because you seem really down. So we don't want to abandon our loved one, but we also don't want to give into the OCD. So when we can think of it as two separate entities, that could be helpful. All right, so final thoughts. I'll start with you, Katy, and then I'll have you round it out, Jason. So Katy, any kind of final thoughts on this topic, or a question or comment or something you'd like to leave everybody with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a topic that we need to keep talking about, like as clinicians in very like broad and generalized settings. So not just affirmative to someone with OCD, but affirmative to marginalized and rising identities community too, which I know is something that we're working on, but we need to keep working on it.
All right, well said. And how about for you, Jason? Any final thoughts to leave everybody with?
Agreed. I just say, to the clinicians watching, just engage in perspective taking. Just, every once in a while, for everybody you work with, like imagine, okay, I'm this person in this room with me, hearing these words. What would that be like? Just try that. Try it out. If you don't do it a lot, if it's not part of your general practice, try it and see what it's like for you.
Awesome. Well, thank you both of you so much for being here today and adding to this conversation. I think it was super important, great interaction. As always, thank you to every single person that jumped on, watched, and supported, commented, asked questions, and supported each other in the chat. A reminder, if you missed some of this and you want to watch the thing in full, or if there's a loved one or a friend or a family member that you think would be absolutely valued in finding this out, definitely make sure that they go to youtube.com/IOCDF. If you go there, you can definitely watch this stream back. The other thing I was going to mention for the people in the chat is I run a free virtual family and loved one support group every second Saturday of the month. So it's not exclusively for family members. It's for kids who have parents with OCD. It's husbands, it's wife, it's neighbors, it's boyfriends. So if you want to join that, I'm going to put my email to you, Skyla, if you could just throw it up real quick. But this is my personal email that Skyla is going to put up. So if you want to be a part of that free group, please go ahead and email me. So we have plenty of people that come on that are spouses, fiancés, and stuff like that to offer support. It's absolutely free. It's open to anyone, anywhere. It's every second Saturday of the month at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you need any general resources, the IOCDF.org is always your place to go. And if you throw a /peace of mind on that, so IOCDF.org/peace of mind, you can see the schedule of upcoming live streams. Once again, I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I want to thank my guests. And as always, there is treatment out there. There is help, there is hope, and there's community. And we here at the IOCDF are glad that you're part of our community. Thank you so much. And thank you, Katy and Jason, once again.
Thank you.
Bye,
Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.